On a narrow iron cot within the freezing confines of a charity ward, a withered old woman breathed her last, alone, ravaged by pneumonia and crushed by the ultimate betrayal. The world ridiculed her as a foolish old woman who had traded her family's honor for a waiter 35 years her junior, while sensational tabloids devoured her downfall as if it were cheap gossip. Yet this broken soul was in truth the granddaughter of Queen Victoria of Great Britain and the sister of the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II. This was Princess Viktoria, an unfortunate royal whose life began in a magnificent red brick palace and ended in the squalor of a boarding room, stripped of absolutely everything. What could drive the sister of a noble emperor to become the easy prey of a petty con artist? Was the catastrophic path she chose merely the senility of an aging fool? Or was it the desperate, piercing scream of a woman imprisoned by the cage of royal duty, yearning, for the first time in 60 years, to simply be loved? Her story began on April 12, 1866, at the New Palace in Potsdam, the sprawling summer residence of the Prussian royal family, christened Friederike Amalia Wilhelmina Victoria. She was the fifth child of Crown Prince Frederick and Victoria, the Princess Royale. From the moment she drew her first breath, she was a political object. Her mother, the brilliant and liberal eldest daughter of Queen Victoria, loathed the rigid militarism of the Prussian court. Her father, destined for the throne, was a gentleman caught between his domineering wife and the disdain of the Iron Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. The family called her Maretta to distinguish her from her mother and grandmother, while her older brother Wilhelm, the future Kaiser, bore a withered arm and a volatile, bombastic temperament. Maretta was different. Physically healthy but psychologically fragile, she grew up in a household that was nothing short of a battlefield. On one side stood her parents, who insisted on speaking English, eating English food, and fostering a domestic intimacy that shocked the Prussians. On the other stood the old Emperor Wilhelm I and Chancellor Bismarck, who viewed this English nursery as a cancerous tumor within the House of Hohenzollern. Maretta was not the beauty of the family. That title belonged to her sister Sophie. Nor was she the intellectual. That was her sister Margaret. Maretta was the difficult one. As a teenager, she struggled intensely with her self-image. In the 1880s, the ideal of feminine beauty was shifting, but the pressure on a princess to be a perfect porcelain doll remained absolute. Maretta felt ungainly, often describing herself as too fat or too awkward. Her mother, though loving, was a perfectionist who constantly critiqued her children's posture, weight, and intellect. Historical records from the palace archives paint a picture of a young woman subjected to the barbaric medical and beauty regimes of the 19th century. Steel baths to toughen the constitution, rigid corsetry to fix a perceived curvature of the spine, and starvation diets to combat a natural tendency toward plumpness. She was a square peg being hammered day by day into a round dynastic hole. But beneath the corsets and the court etiquette, Maretta possessed a romantic, impulsive soul. She was desperate to be loved, not as a highness, but as a woman. And it was this desperation that led to the first great tragedy of her life, the event that broke her spirit long before the Russian waiter was even born. The year was 1881. Maretta was 15 years old. The man was Prince Alexander of Battenburg, known to the family as Sandro. Sandro was everything a teenage princess could dream of. He was handsome, dashing, charismatic, and had just been elected as the ruling prince of Bulgaria. He was a soldier prince, a man of action who cut a striking figure in uniform. When he visited the Prussian court, Maretta fell instantly, irrevocably in love. Crucially, her mother approved. Princess Viktoria saw Sandro as a perfect match. He was liberal. He was practically family. The Battenbergs were related to the British royals. And he was a man of culture. For a brief shining moment, it seemed that Moretta would get the fairy tale ending. She and Sandro exchanged letters. They stole moments of conversation in the gardens of Potsdam. They dreamed of a life in Sofia. The match was, on paper, brilliant, but they had forgotten Bismarck. To Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany and the architect of European geopolitics, the heart of a 15-year-old girl was less than irrelevant. It was a nuisance. Bismarck's entire foreign policy rested on the reinsurance treaty with Russia. He needed to keep the Tsar happy to prevent a war on two fronts. The problem was that the Tsar of Russia hated Sandro of Battenburg. The Tsar viewed Bulgaria as a Russian satellite state, and he viewed Sandro as an upstart puppet who refused to follow Russian orders. If a Prussian princess, the granddaughter of the German emperor, married Sandro, it would signal that Germany supported Bulgaria against Russia. It would destroy Bismarck's alliance. The machinery of the state began to grind Moretta's happiness into dust. When rumors of the engagement reached the ears of old Emperor Wilhelm I, he was apoplectic. He summoned Moretta's father and forbade the match. But Moretta's mother, the stubborn English Princess Royal, refused to back down. She encouraged the romance, perhaps using her daughter's happiness as a weapon against the chancellor she despised. For 7 long years, Moretta lived in a state of suspended animation. She was the pawn in a power struggle between her mother and Bismarck. She was told to wait. She was told that when her father eventually became emperor, he would sanction the marriage and banish Bismarck. She clung to this hope with a terrifying intensity. She refused to look at other suitors. She learned Bulgarian. She prepared herself for a life on the throne of Sofia. She wrote to Sandro, and he wrote back, though his letters became increasingly weary as the years dragged on. Then came the year of the 3 emperors, 1888. Moretta's grandfather, the old tyrant Wilhelm I, finally died. Her father ascended the throne as Emperor Frederick III. This was the moment they had waited for. The liberal dawn had arrived. Moretta, now 22, believed her wedding was imminent. But tragedy struck with brutal timing. Frederick III was already dying. He had developed throat cancer, a gruesome disease that left him unable to speak. Breathing through a silver tube in his trachea, he reigned for only 99 days. During those 99 days, the Battenberg marriage was the central topic of state crisis. Bismarck threatened to resign if the marriage went ahead. He whipped the press into a frenzy, painting the English woman, Moretta's mother, as a traitor who wanted to plunge Germany into war with Russia just to marry off her daughter. The dying emperor, barely able to breathe, was bullied by Bismarck into silence. He could not fight his chancellor while fighting for his life. On June 15, 1888, Frederick III died. The liberal dream died with him, and Moretta's brother Wilhelm II became Kaiser. If Moretta had any hope left, Wilhelm II extinguished it with sadistic efficiency. Wilhelm hated his mother. He hated the English influence, and he was desperate to prove himself to Bismarck and the military establishment. One of his first acts as Kaiser was to terminate the Battenberg affair once and for all. He did not just forbid the marriage, he humiliated his sister. He wrote to Sandro, telling him in no uncertain terms that a marriage into the house of Hohenzollern was impossible. He ordered Moretta to burn her letters. He told the court that his sister's infatuation was a source of national embarrassment. The final blow came in 1889. Sandro, worn down by the politics and realizing that he would never be allowed to marry Moretta, moved on. He fell in love with a commoner, an opera singer named Johanna Leusinger. When the news reached Berlin that Sandro was engaged to an actress, Moretta collapsed. It wasn't just heartbreak, it was a total negation of her identity. She had spent her entire adolescence and young adulthood preparing for a specific role, waiting for a specific man, fighting a specific battle. And she had lost everything. She was 23 years old, on the shelf by royal standards, and publicly branded as the princess who was rejected for political convenience. The psychological damage inflicted during this period cannot be overstated. It taught Moretta a dangerous lesson, that royal duty was a prison, and that her personal happiness was something that would always be stolen from her unless she grabbed it with both hands. It created a deep well of bitterness and a hunger for affection that would lie dormant for decades, only to erupt with catastrophic force in her old age. She became difficult. She developed nerves. She obsessed over her weight even more manically, starving herself to fit into the fashionable waists of the era, trying to exert control over her body since she had no control over her life. She was a ghost in the new palace, watching her brother strut on the world stage while she was relegated to the shadows. But the House of Hohenzollern could not tolerate a spinster princess moping in the corridors. A solution had to be found. If she couldn't marry the man she loved, she would be made to marry a man who was safe, German, and utterly uninspiring. The search for a husband began, not a soulmate, but a keeper for a troubled woman. The solution to the Moretta problem arrived in the shape of Prince Adolf of Schaumburg-Lippe. If Sandro of Battenburg had been a romance novel hero, dashing, controversial, and magnetic, Adolf was a textbook of Prussian mediocrity. He was 7 years older than Victoria, a career soldier with a stiff, waxed mustache and a personality to match. He was a younger son of a minor princely house holding the title of Serene Highness, a rank significantly lower than Victoria's Royal Highness and Imperial Highness. In the grand calculus of European royalty, this was a step down. It was a humiliation masked as a practicality. But the Kaiser wanted his sister out of the new palace, and Moretta, beaten down by the Battenburg scandal, simply wanted to escape. The courtship, if it could be called that, was a bloodless affair. There were no secret letters, no stolen moments in the garden. It was a contract negotiation. Adolf needed the prestige and the money that came with marrying the emperor's sister. Victoria needed a home and a shield against the pitying stares of the Berlin court. In 1890, the engagement was announced. The liberal press, still mourning the death of Victoria's father, sighed in collective disappointment. They saw what was happening. The vibrant, English-raised princess was being shunted off to a minor prince to ensure she caused no further political trouble. The wedding took place on November 19th, 1890, in Berlin. The date is worth remembering, for history has a cruel sense of irony. Exactly 37 years later, on this precise date, Moretta would make the decision that destroyed her life. But on this day in 1890, she stood at the altar in the chapel of the Berlin castle, draped in heavy silk and lace, her face pale and set in a mask of dutiful resignation. Her mother, the Empress Frederick, wrote to Queen Victoria with heartbreaking candor. The wedding was sad. Moretta looked like a victim decked out for the sacrifice. There was no joy in the ceremony. The Kaiser beamed, delighted to have resolved a family nuisance. The groom stood rigid, thinking perhaps of his regiment. The bride said her vows to a stranger. After the festivities, the couple moved to Bonn. They purchased the Palais Schaumburg, a magnificent neoclassical residence on the banks of the Rhine. It was a house built for entertaining, for grand balls and diplomatic receptions. It was a palace that demanded life, but under the tenure of Prince and Princess Adolf, it became a mausoleum of silence. The tragedy of Moretta's first marriage was not that it was violent or abusive, it was that it was utterly empty. Adolf was not a cruel man, but he was a man of limited imagination. He was a soldier through and through. His life revolved around military maneuvers, regimental dinners, and the rigid etiquette of his class. He had no interest in art, no patience for the English softness Moretta had been raised with, and absolutely no capacity to understand the emotional complexities of his wife. He left her alone for months at a time. While Adolf was off playing soldier, inspecting troops, or attending staff rides, Moretta was left to wander the endless corridors of the Palais Schaumburg. She was the mistress of a grand house with no one to host. She tried, desperately, to fill the void. This was the era when her deep loneliness began to calcify into the eccentricity that would mark her later years. She became obsessed with the decoration of the palace. She spent fortunes on furniture, tapestries, and renovations, trying to build a nest that felt like home. She turned to gardening with a fanatical zeal, spending hours directing gardeners, planting roses, and designing landscapes. It was a way to exert control, to make something grow in a life that felt increasingly sterile. But the one thing she wanted most, the one thing that might have saved her from the encroaching darkness, was denied to her. Early in the marriage, there was a glimmer of hope. Moretta became pregnant. The joy was palpable. A child would give her a purpose. A child would give her someone to love who could not be taken away by Bismarck or the Kaiser. The pregnancy ended in a miscarriage. The physical pain was agonizing, but the psychological blow was fatal to the marriage. There would be no other pregnancies. The doctors offered no solutions. The silence in the Palais Schaumburg deepened. Adolf, uncomfortable with female grief and disappointed by the lack of an heir, withdrew further into his military duties. He treated his wife with a polite, distant courtesy that was colder than hatred. They lived separate lives under the same roof, two strangers bound by a contract, passing each other in the hallways like ghosts. As the years ground on, Moretta watched from her gilded cage as her siblings lived the lives she had been denied. Her younger sister Sophie married the crown prince of Greece and eventually became a queen, founding a dynasty. Her sister Margaret married a Hessian prince and found genuine domestic happiness. Even her brother Wilhelm, for all his bluster and madness, had a large family and the adoration of a nation. Moretta had her roses. She had her needlepoint. She had her servants. She began to change. The slim, hopeful girl of the 1880s vanished. In her place emerged a matronly, somewhat heavy-set woman who dressed with a dowdy, old-fashioned propriety. She ate to comfort herself. Food became one of her few reliable pleasures. The palace kitchens were instructed to prepare rich, heavy meals, and Moretta, sitting alone at a dining table meant for 30, would consume them in silence. She struggled constantly with her weight, trying crash diets that made her miserable, only to relapse into comfort eating. She tried to play the role of the Angel of Bonn. She patronized local charities, she opened bazaars, she visited hospitals. The people of Bonn respected her. They saw a dignified, slightly sad royal lady who waved from her carriage. They did not see the woman who paced her bedroom at night, terrified of the quiet. She was Imperial Highness, the Kaiser's sister, a figure of awe. This pedestal was a prison. It meant she could have no real friends. Everyone who approached her did so with a bow or a curtsy. No one spoke to her as a human being. She was surrounded by sycophants and servants, isolated by the very protocol meant to elevate her. Then came 1914. The guns of August shattered the stifling peace of the Victorian era. For Moretta, the outbreak of the First World War was a catastrophe on a personal level before it was a national one. Her family was torn apart. Her mother's family, the British royals, were now the enemy. Her beloved cousin, George V, was the King of England, at war with her brother the Kaiser. The English identity she had secretly cherished was now treasonous. Adolf, despite being nearly 55, returned to active service. He was a general now, eager to do his duty for the fatherland. For the first 2 years of the war, Moretta lived in a state of suspended dread. The Palais Schaumburg became a hub of wartime charity work, but the activity was manic, a distraction from the looming precipice. In July 1916, the telegram arrived. Prince Adolf was dead. He had not died a glorious death in a charge. He died somewhat prosaically while serving in the military administration. But he was gone. Moretta was 50 years old and she was a widow. The grief she felt was complex. It was not the searing agony of losing a soulmate. It was the panic of losing a protector. Adolf had been dull, yes, but he had been a structure. He was the reason she lived in Bonn. He was the anchor of her social existence. Without him, she was just a childless, aging woman in a massive house that was rapidly becoming too expensive to maintain. For the next 2 years, as Germany starved and bled to death in the trenches, Moretta lived a ghostly existence. She wore deep mourning blacks that she would hardly ever take off. She watched as the world she understood, the world of emperors, kings, and divinely ordained rites, crumbled to dust. November 1918 brought the end of the world. The sailors in Kiel mutinied. The revolution spread like wildfire. On November 9th, her brother Wilhelm II abdicated the throne and fled like a thief in the night to the Netherlands. The German Empire, the entity her family had built with blood and iron, ceased to exist. Moretta was terrified. She remembered the stories of the French Revolution. She heard the news coming out of Russia. The Bolsheviks had murdered the Tsar and his entire family in a cellar in Yekaterinburg. She was a Hohenzollern. She was a symbol of the old regime. She waited in the Palais Schaumburg for the mob to come and drag her out to the guillotine. But the German Revolution was not the Russian Revolution. The mob did not come. The Weimar Republic was declared, and while the titles and political power were stripped away, the private property remained. The Royal Highness became legally a private citizen with a very long name. The silence in the Palais Schaumburg changed quality. It was no longer the silence of a stiff formal court. It was the silence of a tomb. The servants, sensing the shift in power, became fewer. The money, though still substantial on paper, began to feel finite as inflation started its slow, creeping ascent. Victoria was 52 years old in 1918. She was a relic. The new Germany was a place of jazz, cabaret, socialism, and aggressive modernity. It was the world of Babylon Berlin, a place where a stiff, corseted Prussian princess made no sense. She retreated further behind the high walls of her palace. She was safe, she told herself. She had her fortune. She had her house. She had her memories. She was the dowager princess destined to fade away quietly into the history books, a footnote to her brother's disastrous reign. But inside the dowager, the heart of the 15-year-old girl who loved Sandro of Battenburg was not dead. It was merely starving. The repression of 50 years had created a pressure cooker. She was lonely, with a physical intensity that was almost painful. She craved youth. She craved life. She craved the noise and the color she had been denied by Bismarck, by Wilhelm, by Adolf, and by the war. She was a sitting duck, and outside the gates of the Palais Schaumburg, the world was full of wolves. The chaotic, desperate atmosphere of Weimar Germany was a breeding ground for con artists, impostors, and adventurers, men who had lost everything in the war and were looking for a way to climb back up using whatever ladder they could find. It was in this twilight period, the mid-1920s, that the final trap began to set itself. Moretta, trying to bridge the gap between her isolation and the modern world, began to open the doors of the Palais Schaumburg. She wanted to be relevant. She wanted to be surrounded by youth. She began to host teas for the university students of Bonn. She told herself she was being a patroness of the arts, a benevolent grandmother figure to the new generation. She did not realize that by opening those doors, she was inviting the devil to tea. The year 1927 arrived in Bonn not with a fanfare of trumpets, but with a syncopated rhythm of jazz and the roar of the new, vulgar engines of commerce. For the 61-year-old Princess Viktoria, living in the echo chamber of the Palais Schaumburg, the roaring 20s were a foreign country. She was a woman out of time, her silhouette often draped in heavy fabrics that had been fashionable in the previous century, moved through the streets of Bonn like a dark cloud drifting against the wind. But inside the palace, the air was changing. In a desperate bid to stave off the crushing silence that had enveloped her life since the death of Prince Adolf, Victoria had made a decision that would have been unthinkable in the days of the Empire. She opened her doors. She did not open them to the stiff, terrified aristocracy who were busy counting their dwindling pennies and mourning the Kaiser. She opened them to the future. She began to host tea afternoons for the students of the University of Bonn. It was an innocent enough idea on the surface. The lonely dowager princess playing the role of the benevolent patroness surrounded by the bright young minds of the new Germany. She imagined polite conversation about Goethe and Schiller, a way to connect with the youth she had never been allowed to be. But the students who came were not the deferential subjects of 1890. They were the children of the Great War, cynical, hungry, ambitious, and fascinated by the morbid spectacle of a fallen royal. They drank her tea, ate her cakes, and whispered about the crazy old princess behind their hands. And then one afternoon in the spring of 1927, the wolf walked in. His name was Alexander Anatolovich Zubkov. To the eyes of the sheltered princess, he was a vision of tragic romance. He was tall, with the dark, brooding looks of a matinee idol, slicked back dark hair, intense eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 sorrows, and a manner that was at once deferential and dangerously confident. He was 26 years old. He was younger than the princess's nephews. He was 35 years her junior. Zubkov presented himself as a victim of history, a mirror to her own suffering. He told her he was a Russian nobleman, a refugee from the Bolshevik terror who had lost his estates, his family, and his fortune to the Red Menace. He spoke of fleeing across frozen steppes, of a life of luxury stolen by revolutionaries. It was a story calculated to resonate perfectly with a woman whose own brother had been toppled by a revolution, whose own world had been shattered by political forces she couldn't control. The truth, however, was far more sordid. The police files of the Weimar Republic, which would soon bulge with reports on him, told a different story. Zubkov was born in Ivanovo, a textile town. His origins were middle class at best, certainly not aristocratic. Since fleeing Russia, he had not lived the life of a noble exile, but that of a grifter. He had drifted through the underbelly of Europe's capitals. In Berlin, he had been a ballroom dancer for hire. In Paris, he had allegedly worked as a waiter. In the darker corners of the rumor mill, it was whispered that he was a gigolo, a man who traded his youth and exoticism for the financial support of wealthy older women. But Moretta did not see a waiter. She saw a prince in exile. She saw Sandro of Battenburg return to her, reincarnated in a younger, more desperate form. The courtship was swift, predatory, and masterful. Zubkov identified Moretta's vulnerability immediately. She was a woman who had never been listened to. For her entire life she had been told what to do, where to stand, whom to marry. Zubkov did the opposite. He sat at her feet in the drawing room of the Palais Schaumburg. He listened to her stories of the old court. He played the piano for her, sweeping, romantic Russian melodies that filled the empty halls with passion. He looked at her not as a fat, aging relic, but as a woman of substance and beauty. He isolated her. This is the classic maneuver of the con artist. He made himself indispensable to her happiness. When he was there, the palace was full of light and music. When he left, the silence returned, heavier and more terrifying than before. He created an addiction. Moretta began to live for his visits. She began to gift him money, small amounts at first, loans, to help a distressed nobleman get back on his feet, to buy a decent suit, to pay for his studies. The studies were a sham. Zubkov was technically enrolled at the university, but he rarely attended lectures. His real occupation was the seduction of the Kaiser's sister. By the summer of 1927, the dynamic had shifted from patronage to romance. The servants at the Palais Schaumburg were the first to notice. They saw the lingering touches, the way the princess giggled like a schoolgirl, the late hours the student kept at the palace. They were horrified. To the old retainers, loyal to the memory of the Hohenzollerns, this was a desecration. A Russian vagabond with no background, wooing the daughter of an emperor? It was grotesque. Rumors began to leak out of the palace gates. They swirled through the cafes of Bonn and eventually reached the ears of the family. The House of Hohenzollern, even in exile, operated on a network of gossip and surveillance. When the news reached Doorn in the Netherlands, where the former Kaiser Wilhelm II was chopping wood and brooding over his lost throne, the reaction was nuclear. Wilhelm was apoplectic. He had forbidden Moretta's marriage to Sandro of Battenburg 40 years earlier because Sandro was a prince of a minor state who might offend Russia. Now his sister proposed to marry a Russian nobody, a man young enough to be her grandson, a man with dirt under his fingernails. It was not just a scandal. It was an act of treason against the family name. The Kaiser sent emissaries. He sent letters that dripped with the old imperial venom. He forbade the match. He commanded her to cease contact with the Russian immediately. He threatened to cut her off from the family entirely. Other relatives joined the chorus. Her sister Margaret, usually the sensible one, implored her to see reason. They pointed out the age gap. They pointed out his lack of money. They pointed out the sheer absurdity of the situation. But they made a critical error. They treated Moretta as the submissive pawn she had been in 1881. They forgot that she was now a 61-year-old widow who controlled her own fortune. They forgot the deep, festering wound of the Battenburg affair. For Moretta, the family's opposition was not a deterrent. It was an accelerant. Every letter from the Kaiser reminding her of her duty only reminded her of the time he had crushed her happiness to please Bismarck. Every demand to break off the engagement only solidified her resolve. She saw herself as the heroine of a great tragedy, fighting for love against a cold, unfeeling system. She projected all her lost hopes onto Zubkov. He was not just a lover. He was her rebellion. He was her way of screaming at her brother, at Bismarck's ghost, at the whole rigid Prussian machinery. I exist. I have needs, and this time I will not obey. Zubkov, sensing the closing net, pressed his advantage. He proposed marriage. He spun a narrative of us against the world. He played the victim, offering to leave if his love was causing her too much pain. knowing full well that the threat of his departure would terrify her into compliance. She said yes. The announcement of the engagement in the autumn of 1927 hit the German press like a bombshell. The Kaiser's sister to marry Russian boy. The Princess and the Waiter. It was the scandal of the decade. The Weimar press, free from imperial censorship, tore the story apart with glee. They mocked the age difference. They dug into Zubkov's background. They published cartoons of the elderly princess doting on a child. But Moretta was past the point of shame. She was in a manic state of infatuation. She liquidated assets to buy him a wardrobe fit for a prince. She planned a wedding. The family played their final card, the boycott. They informed her that if she proceeded, she was dead to them. No Hohenzollern would attend. She would be stripped of her rank within the family order. Moretta's response was a gesture of supreme defiance. If being a Hohenzollern meant being lonely and controlled, she would stop being a Hohenzollern. On November 19th, 1927, a date chosen with chilling symbolism, exactly 37 years to the day after her joyless wedding to Prince Adolf, Viktoria married Alexander Zubkov. The ceremony was a surreal piece of theater. It began with a civil ceremony at the Bonn Town Hall. The streets were packed not with cheering loyalists, but with gawkers, journalists, and curious onlookers, hoping to catch a glimpse of the freak show. Viktoria stepped out of her car, not in the reserved grace of a widow, but in a dress that tried too hard to be youthful. Beside her, Zubkov looked like a predator who had just swallowed the canary, smug, polished, and visibly triumphant. They proceeded to a Greek Orthodox ceremony, a nod to Zubkov's supposed heritage. Inside the church, the pews on the bride's side were glaringly, painfully empty. There was no Kaiser Wilhelm, no sister Sophie, no sister Margaret, not a single cousin, nephew, or aunt. The House of Hohenzollern had carried out its threat. She stood alone, surrounded only by Zubkov's motley collection of friends, fellow émigrés, hangers-on, and people of questionable reputation. At the altar, Viktoria made her final sacrifice. She formally renounced her royal titles. She gave up the style of imperial and royal highness. She signed the register not as a princess of Prussia, but as Frau Alexander Zubkov. She wore her mother's lace veil, the same veil the Empress Frederick had worn in 1858. It was a holy relic of the Victorian age, draped over a marriage that was a mockery of everything her mother had stood for. As they emerged from the church, the flashbulbs popped, blinding the newlyweds. The reporters shouted questions. "Mrs. Zubkov! Mrs. Zubkov!" The name felt strange, alien, but Viktoria smiled. She gripped the arm of her young husband tightly, her knuckles white. She looked at the cameras with a defiance that masked a terrible creeping anxiety. She had burned the bridge. The ships were destroyed. There was no going back to the safety of the Palais Schomburg's silence. She had purchased her happiness at the cost of her identity. She believed she had won. She believed that the young man holding her arm loved her for her soul, that they would retire to the palace and live a life of art, music, and romance, proving the cynics and the Kaiser wrong. She did not know that the ink on the marriage certificate was barely dry before Zubkov's eyes began to wander to the checkbook. She did not know that she had not married a savior, but a parasite. The honeymoon was about to begin, and it would be a descent into a financial and emotional hell that would make her years of loneliness look like paradise. The trap had snapped shut. The wolf was inside the house, and he had the keys to the vault. The honeymoon did not last weeks. It lasted hours. If Viktoria had expected a romantic idyll, a quiet retreat into domestic bliss, where she and her Sasha could read poetry by the fire, she was brutally disabused of that notion before the wedding flowers had even wilted. Alexander Zubkov had not married a woman, he had married a bank account. And now that the ring was on his finger and the legal documents signed, he saw no reason to maintain the charade of the humble, devoted admirer. The transformation was immediate and terrifying. The deferential student vanished. In his place stood the master of the Palais Schaumburg. Zubkov, the boy who had scraped a living as a dancer and a drifter, now found himself lord of a Prussian palace, and he attacked his new role with the voracious appetite of a starving man set loose at a banquet. The silence of the palace, which Victoria had cultivated for years as a shield against the world, was shattered. Zubkov bought a gramophone. He filled the hallowed halls of the Hohenzollerns with the raucous, syncopated rhythms of jazz and American foxtrots. He invited his friends, a motley crew of Russian émigrés, hangers-on, and sycophants he had picked up in the nightclubs of Cologne, to treat the palace as their private clubhouse. The old servants, men and women who had served Prince Adolf and who remembered the dignity of the imperial era, watched in horror. They were ordered about by a 26-year-old foreigner who treated them with the arrogance of a petty tyrant. One by one, the loyal retainers, who had been Victoria's only real family for decades, handed in their notices or were fired for insolence when they failed to jump fast enough to light Zubkov's cigarette. The institutional memory of the house was being purged, replaced by a chaotic retinue of Zubkov's choosing. But the staffing changes were a minor issue compared to the spending. Zubkov had a hole in his soul that only money could fill. He developed an obsession with speed. He went to the finest dealerships in the Rhineland and bought a powerful motorcycle. When that bored him, he bought a sports car, then another. He drove like a maniac, tearing through the quiet streets of Bonn, terrifying pedestrians and drawing the attention of the police. He crashed frequently. It didn't matter. When a car was wrecked, he simply abandoned it and bought a new one, charging it to Frau Zubkov's accounts. He fancied himself a gentleman of leisure. He ordered dozens of bespoke suits from the best tailors in Berlin and London. He bought silk shirts by the crate. He adorned himself with gold cigarette cases, diamond cufflinks, and heavy signet rings, playing the part of the Russian prince he had always claimed to be. And where was Moretta while her husband was burning through her inheritance? She was right there, watching it happen, paralyzed by a toxic cocktail of denial and pride. She had defied her brother, the Kaiser. She had defied her entire family. She had publicly declared that Alexander Zubkov was her soulmate, a man of honor and depth. To admit now that he was a grifter would be to admit that the Kaiser was right. It would be a humiliation so total that her psyche simply refused to accept it. So, she rationalized. She told herself that Sasha was just high-spirited. She told herself that he had suffered so much during the Russian Revolution, losing everything, that he deserved a little fun now. She told herself that his wildness was just the exuberance of youth, the very youth she craved. She became his enabler. When the bills arrived, she signed the checks. When he crashed a car, she smoothed things over with the police. When the servants complained, she sided with her husband. But the private disaster soon became a public spectacle. Zubkov was not content to spend money at home. He wanted an audience. He became a fixture in the nightlife of Cologne. Every night, the Baron, as he liked to be called, would hold court in the most expensive cabarets and nightclubs. He would order champagne for the whole room, tossing 100-mark notes around like confetti. He was the center of attention, the man of the hour, buying the adoration of strangers with his wife's money. Moretta would often accompany him, a tragic figure sitting stiffly at a table covered in bottles, wearing her dowdy clothes and her heavy jewelry, smiling anxiously while her young husband danced with other women. The age gap, which she had tried to ignore, became grotesque under the harsh electric lights of the cabaret. She looked like his grandmother, paying for the privilege of his company. The press, of course, was there. The Weimar Republic's tabloids were ruthless. They chronicled every excess. They ran photos of Zubkov looking drunk and disheveled, hanging off the arms of flappers and showgirls, with captions that mocked the poor, deluded princess. They called him the waiter. They called him the gigolo. The humiliation deepened when Zubkov stopped bothering to bring Moretta along. He began to disappear for days at a time. Rumors of infidelity were rampant. He was seen with actresses, with dancers, with women his own age. When he returned to the Palais Schaumburg, hungover and smelling of cheap perfume, Moretta would nurse him back to health, listening to his transparent lies about business meetings or visiting sick friends. The financial bleeding was catastrophic. In the space of less than a year, Zubkov managed to spend what most people would not earn in 10 lifetimes. The fortune that Moretta had carefully preserved through the collapse of the empire and the hyperinflation of 1923 was evaporating. He wasn't just spending income, he was eating into the capital. He engaged in bizarre, delusional business schemes. He announced plans to send an expedition to the Congo. He talked about investing in film studios. He claimed he was writing a great historical opus. Each scheme required upfront capital, which vanished into his pockets and then into the tills of bars and casinos. By early 1928, the situation had spiraled into criminality. Zubkov began writing checks that the banks refused to honor. He assaulted a waiter in a Cologne nightclub who had insulted him. He was involved in drunken brawls in the street. The police of Bonn and Cologne had had enough. The Weimar authorities had initially treated Moretta with the deference due to a former royal, turning a blind eye to her husband's antics. But Zubkov was testing the limits of their patience. He was a foreigner, a Russian with murky papers, causing public disorder and running up massive debts that were destabilizing local businesses. In March 1928, the hammer fell. The German government declared Alexander Zubkov an undesirable alien. An expulsion order was drafted. He was to be deported from the German Reich. This should have been Moretta's wake-up call. It should have been the moment she cut him loose. The state was handing her an exit strategy on a silver platter. All she had to do was let him go. But she didn't. Her reaction was heartbreakingly predictable. She panicked. She viewed the deportation order not as a rescue, but as persecution. She believed, or forced herself to believe, that this was the work of her enemies. Perhaps even her brother, the Kaiser, pulling strings from exile to destroy her happiness. She hired lawyers. She petitioned the government. She begged for an extension. She argued that tearing a husband from his wife was a violation of human rights. Her efforts were futile. The authorities were adamant Zubkov had to go. In April 1928, less than 5 months after their wedding, Alexander Zubkov was escorted to the border. He crossed into Luxembourg, leaving Moretta behind in the Palais Schaumburg. The separation was physical, but not emotional. Moretta remained devoted. She telephoned him daily. She wired him money constantly. Zubkov, now unleashed in Europe without the nagging presence of his wife, continued his rampage. He moved from Luxembourg to Brussels and then to Paris. In each city, the pattern repeated. He checked into the most expensive hotel, ran up massive bills, caused a scandal, and then wired Bonn for more funds. Moretta, sitting alone in the wreckage of her life, became a remote control ATM for a man who was laughing at her. The debts began to mature. The creditors, who had held off demanding payment out of respect for the princess, realized that the money was running out. They started to call. The trickle of invoices became a flood. Tailors, jewelers, car dealerships, wine merchants, hotels in Paris, hotels in Brussels. Everyone wanted their money. Moretta looked at the ledgers and felt the blood drain from her face. The numbers were impossible. 900,000 marks. To put that figure in perspective, in 1928, a skilled worker might earn 200 marks a month. Zubkov had spent nearly 1,000,000. It was a sum that could bankrupt a small town. She tried to sell things quietly, a painting here, a piece of jewelry there, but the hole was too deep. She took out mortgages on the Palais Schaumburg, leveraging the roof over her head to pay for her husband's champagne habit in Paris. She was stripping the lead from the lifeboats to feed the furnace of a sinking ship. And still, she defended him. When a journalist managed to corner her in late 1928 and asked about the rumors of divorce, Moretta drew herself up with the last shreds of her imperial dignity and said, "I love my husband. He is merely misunderstood. We shall be reunited soon." She was living in a fantasy world, but reality was about to kick down the door. Zubkov, meanwhile, was burning bridges across the continent. Luxembourg expelled him. Belgium expelled him. He was running out of countries. He ended up in France writing a memoir for a tabloid newspaper, selling the intimate details of his marriage to the Kaiser's sister for quick cash. He painted himself as a victim of royal snobbery, a lover torn from his soulmate, all while living with a mistress in a Paris apartment paid for by Moretta's wire transfers. Back in Bonn, the silence of the Palais Schaumburg had returned, but it was different now. It was the silence of impending doom. The servants were gone, replaced by a skeleton crew of day laborers. The grand rooms were dusty. The heating was turned down to save coal. The Princess Viktoria, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, sister of the Kaiser, sat in her cold drawing room, reading the letters from the bank. The tone of the letters had shifted from polite concern to legal threats. Foreclosure was not a possibility. It was a certainty. The illusion was cracking. The sheer weight of the financial evidence was beginning to pierce the armor of her denial. She began to realize that Sasha wasn't coming back to rescue her. He wasn't working on a business deal that would pay off the debts. He was just gone, and he had left her holding the bag. The winter of 1928 bled into 1929. The creditors formed a coalition. They went to the courts. They demanded the liquidation of the estate to satisfy the debts. The court granted the order. The Palais Schaumburg, the contents, the land, everything was seized. The bailiffs arrived not with swords, but with clipboards. They walked through the rooms where emperors had slept. They placed stickers on the furniture. Lot 1, Lot 2, Lot 3. Victoria watched them tag her life. She saw a sticker placed on the desk where her father had written his diary. She saw a sticker on the vase her mother had loved. She saw a sticker on her own bed. She was being erased. The honeymoon was officially over. Now came the reckoning. The Kaiser's sister was about to face the ultimate indignity, a public auction of her existence. The hammer fell for the first time on a damp October morning in 1929. The auction of the contents of the Palais Schaumburg was not merely a commercial transaction. It was a public autopsy of the House of Hohenzollern. The auctioneers from the Cologne firm of M. Lempertz had done their work with brutal efficiency. They had catalogued a life. The catalog itself was a thick, depressing document, listing thousands of lots that represented the accumulated history of a woman who was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria and the sister of the German emperor. The gates of the palace, usually barred to the common man, were thrown open. The public flooded in. They were not there to pay respects. They were there to hunt for bargains and to gawk at the wreckage of a royal scandal. Dealers from Berlin, London, and Paris rubbed shoulders with curious housewives from Bonn and scruffy students who just wanted to see inside the crazy princess's bedroom. Victoria remained inside the palace during the viewing days, hiding in a small suite of rooms she had been allowed to retain until the sale was complete. She could hear the footsteps of the strangers tramping through the corridors. She could hear the murmur of voices discussing the value of her mother's china, the provenance of her silver, the quality of her bed linen. It was a violation so profound that it left her physically ill. The sale itself was a disaster. The timing could not have been worse. October 1929 was the month the world economy began to suffer its death throes. The Wall Street crash was happening in slow motion across the Atlantic. The German economy was already fragile. There was little money for luxuries. The Times of London, observing the proceedings with a mixture of fascination and pity, reported spiritless bidding. Items of immense historical significance went for a pittance. A silver dinner service, heavy with the crest of the Prussian royal family, was sold for the price of scrap metal. Delicate porcelain vases, gifts from Prince Albert to his daughter, were knocked down to dealers who barely looked up from their catalogs. The tragedy was mathematical. The auction raised a significant sum, but when the auctioneers took their commission and the court costs were deducted, the remainder was pitiful. It covered only about 1/3 of the debts Alexander Zubkov had accrued. The creditors were not satisfied. They took the rest. They took the cash. They took the remaining assets. And finally, they took the palace itself. In late October, the order came. Victoria had to leave. There is a specific kind of horror in the image of the 63-year-old princess packing her bags. She did not have a retinue of maids to help her. She packed her own clothes, the few that hadn't been sold. She took a few personal mementos that the bailiffs had kindly overlooked, some photographs, a Bible, a few letters. She walked out of the Palais Schaumburg for the last time. She did not look back at the neoclassical columns or the rose gardens she had tended for 30 years. She climbed into a taxi, not a royal carriage. She moved to the suburb of Melem. Her new home was a single furnished room in a boarding house. It was clean, but it was stark. There was a bed, a chair, a washstand. It was the kind of room inhabited by struggling clerks or impoverished widows. For the first time in her life, Victoria was truly alone. There were no servants to light the fire, no cook to prepare the heavy meals she loved, no secretary to answer her mail. The silence here was different from the silence of the palace. It was the silence of irrelevance. It was in this small, cold room that the fog finally cleared from her mind, stripped of her titles, her home, her fortune, and her dignity. Victoria finally allowed herself to see the truth. She looked at the four walls of her rented room and realized that Sasha was not coming. He was in Paris, spending the last of the money he had squeezed out of her, likely sharing a bed with a woman half her age. He had not written. He had not called. He did not care that she was sleeping in a boarding house. The denial broke, and when it broke, it shattered her. In the first week of November 1929, Victoria summoned a lawyer. It was the last act of agency she would ever perform. She instructed him to file for divorce. The legal petition she signed was a document of utter humiliation. In it, she laid bare the reality of her marriage to the world. She cited his expulsion from Germany. She cited his willful failure to support her. But the most damning clause, the one that proved the entire affair had been a cruel farce, was the admission of non-consummation, or a lack of conjugal relations. It was an admission that the romance had been alive from the wedding night onwards. She had not been a wife, she had been a mark. The filing of the divorce papers seemed to sever the last thread holding her to life. Her body, weakened by the stress of the auction and years of comfort eating, gave up. The damp chill of the November Rhine seeped into her lungs. She developed a fever. A cough began to rattle in her chest. Alone in her room in Melem, she deteriorated rapidly. Her landlady, realizing the gravity of the situation, called for help. Victoria was transferred to the St. Francis Hospital in Bonn. It was a charitable Catholic institution run by nuns. The irony was sharp. The daughter of the aggressively Protestant House of Hohenzollern, the granddaughter of the head of the Church of England, was dying in a Catholic ward. She lay in a simple iron bed. The fever burned through her. In her delirium, did she dream of the new palace in Potsdam? Did she see the face of Sandro of Battenburg, her first lost love? Or did she only see the smiling, predatory face of the waiter who had ruined her? The news of her illness reached the family, but the House of Hohenzollern remained frozen in its pride. No brother rushed from Dorn, no sister rushed from Friedrichshof. They were paralyzed by the scandal, unable to associate themselves with the woman who had dragged their name through the mud of the tabloids. She died on November 13, 1929. It was a Wednesday. She was 63 years old. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but the world knew she had died of a broken heart and a broken life. The death of a princess usually stops the nation. Flags fly at half-mast. Regiments march in slow time. But for Victoria, there was only an awkward silence. The arrangements for the funeral fell to her sister Margaret, the Landgravine of Hesse. Margaret was the only one who showed a flicker of humanity, though even she was constrained by the family's anger. It was decided that Victoria would not be buried in the imperial mausoleum in Potsdam with her parents. She would not be buried in the Hohenzollern crypt in Berlin. She was to be buried at Schloss Friedrichshof, near Kronberg, the home of her sister Margaret. It was a quiet, private location, away from the public eye. The funeral took place on November 16th. It was a somber, muted affair. A few representatives of the former royal houses attended dressed in black, their faces grim. They were burying a problem, not a beloved sister. Alexander Zubkov did not attend. He was busy in Luxembourg and Paris, dodging his own creditors. When told of his wife's death, he reportedly expressed a shallow regret, but his primary concern was whether he had been left anything in the will. He had not. The epilogue of Alexander Zubkov is brief and sordid, a fitting footnote to the tragedy he engineered. He did not enjoy his spoils for long. He had burned through the money as fast as he stole it. By 1930, he was destitute. He drifted through Europe, a prince without a penny, his looks fading, his charm wearing thin. The tuberculosis that had shadowed him, a disease of poverty, flared up. He died in a hospital in Paris on January 28, 1936. He was 34 years old. He died as he had lived, a nobody, relying on the charity of strangers to bury him. If you visit the cemetery at Kronberg today, you will find the grave of Princess Viktoria. It is dignified, quiet, and removed from the grand narrative of German history. History has not been kind to Moretta. She is often dismissed as a footnote, a caricature of the foolish, aging woman who fell for a pretty face. She is the punchline to a joke about the decline of the aristocracy. But to view her only as a fool is to miss the profound tragedy of her existence. Victoria was a victim of a system that dehumanized its own children. She was a woman who was taught that her emotions were dangerous, that her happiness was secondary to the state, and that her only value lay in who she married. When the state collapsed in 1918, it left her without a purpose, but with all the emotional scars intact. She was a bird bred in a cage, released into the wild at age 52, unable to fly, unable to hunt, and utterly defenseless against the predators circling below. Her marriage to Zubkov was not just a folly, it was a scream. It was a desperate, chaotic, an ultimately suicidal rebellion against 60 years of being told no. It was the act of a woman who would rather burn down her own life than spend one more day in the cold, gray silence of her duty. In the end, the Kaiser's sister found the one thing that had eluded her since she was a teenager in love with the Battenburg prince. She found an exit. It was a tragic, humiliating, and lonely exit, but it was finally her own. The auctioneer's hammer in 1929 didn't just sell her furniture, it sounded the final death knell of the Victorian world she was born into. She lies now in Kronberg, not as an empress or a queen, but as a woman who tried to buy love because she had never been given it for free.